A great fight scene is rooted in believability. When a fight scene is plausible, it lets you get immersed in the action, and you completely forget that you're watching a character who's required for the plot to advance. But writing a believable fight scene is hard enough as is, and it gets even more challenging when you include a female character in it. See, women are generally subject to a different rule set when it comes to combat scenes. One thing people dislike is when a female character is able to effortlessly throw around goons that appear a foot taller and 30 pounds heavier than them. Of course, there are some ways to circumvent this, for example, making the female character a superhero, giving them special powers, or just making them even bigger than the men she's beating up, but not every story can take these creative liberties. So here's how to write fight scenes with women, or less physically imposing characters in general, without sacrificing believability. But before we can get to that, a spoiler warning for the following pieces of media. And now let's get into the video. Step 1. Have your female character get hit when it makes sense. First of all, I'm a big fan of having fights where neither side gets out scot-free. A fight is like a conversation between two parties, but instead of words being exchanged, it's bullets, punches, kicks to the groin, and all that. And it's not very fun when one side gets to dish out everything and the other side is made completely useless. For the longest time, Hollywood has been afraid of portraying women in these brutal fight scenes, as seeing women get brutalized is something that general audiences have viewed as uncomfortable. After all, it's only relatively recently that people have pushed back against the idea that women are delicate little flowers that need to be protected. But I am a believer in true gender equality. I believe it's sexist not to show a woman getting beaten up in a fight just because she's a woman. But more than that, showing the female character getting hurt illustrates a few things that are quite important to the audience. Number 1, getting hurt shows that the character is imperfect and has flaws. This humanizes the character, grounding them in reality, and shows the audience that even though they're a woman, they're still subjected to the rules of humanity. If you bleed when you get hit, then you can die, and that's a simple, time-tested way of creating stakes in a fight scene. But it also does number 2. It shows that the enemy is competent enough to exploit the character's said flaws. One of my biggest pet peeves in action movies or fight scenes in general is when disposable thugs have to take some sort of intelligence debuff to make the main character feel more powerful than they feasibly should be. I think it's lazy writing when bad guys don't act like people, but instead like mannequins waiting for their turn in the meat grinder that is the main character. Having your character get hit illustrates competent opponents, increasing believability, but also showing that the character is truly competent and not playing on easy mode against opponents who are nerfed by bad writing. But note that having your character get hit isn't always a necessity. Sometimes the power level between the female character and the opponent is just too great that it would actually be less believable for them to get hit and bleed. One-sided fights can still be interesting if they're used as exposition to illustrate how powerful a character is and are a fair exception. But if the female character and their opponent are on a relatively similar power level and she doesn't get hit somehow, that's not a good realistic fight scene, that's a girl power scene in bad disguise. And now we'll get into some examples, starting off with Black Widow's introduction scene in the first Avengers movie. Note that it's explained later on in the MCU that Black Widow had training in the Red Room and her body has an enhanced physiology because of it, but honestly that feels like a bit of a retcon. At the time that the Avengers took place, general audiences thought that Widow was just a normal person without any real powers. Now, Black Widow is tied in a chair, she's able to take the first guy by surprise, and then these two immediately rush her, but it turns out that one of them had a gun the whole time, so why not shoot her while she's tied to a damn chair? To be completely fair, she does get grappled, but she somehow manages to break free despite getting bear hugged from behind. Remember that ScarJo is 5'3" and looks like she's about 120 pounds in the movie? How she's able to escape a grapple despite the implied strength difference is pretty egregious. Should she still win the fight? Probably, but 1v3 tied to a chair while the enemies are armed, she plausibly shouldn't get out without nary a scratch on her. So now let's move on to a good example, which I'll be pulling from 2023's Black Panther Wakanda Forever. This is the final battle of the film with Shuri being thrust into the role of Black Panther after her brother's tragic death, and she's faced with a formidable opponent in Namor the Submariner. I love this scene because it kind of represents the story of the film surrounding it, with Shuri being put in a role that she never really wanted, becoming the Black Panther after the passing of T'Challa's actor Chadwick Boseman. Rest in peace. But ultimately, she's inexperienced as a fighter and it shows. While T'Challa would undoubtedly make quick work of Namor, Shuri struggles and gets tossed around like a ragdoll. And this is completely believable and in character. Remember that she's a teenager fighting against a tyrant that is probably hundreds of years old. Of course, she's gonna get hammered and this dub isn't gonna come easy, and I'm glad that they showed her having to struggle in this fight. But you can also do a fight scene where the female character is overpowered and still have it be believable, like during Hela's invasion of Asgard in Thor Ragnarok. Like I said earlier, sometimes a fight scene serves as good exposition, illustrating how powerful a character is. Hela's invasion of Asgard is a memorable scene from the movie, showing how dangerous she is and how hopeless people may feel when facing her. Note that before this scene, the movie took its time hyping Hela up as this massive threat. She's Odin's firstborn and the goddess of death herself. And up to this point in the film, it's almost all talk. And then we finally get to see her earn that title. And it's a goddamn massacre. She absolutely decimates Asgard's army, foot soldiers, and battleships alike. And this is completely believable, at least to me, because they spent half the film hyping her up as this massive threat. And they try to overwhelm her, but they simply cannot get to her because she's just that powerful. In fact, one guy even manages to land a hit, but she shrugs it off like it's nothing. And I like Waititi's directing choice of not emphasizing that hit because it shows how hopeless the situation is, that even a direct stab through her body accomplishes nothing. And this absolute slaughter of a scene is 100% earned. This isn't some MMA fighter that Hollywood is propping up as some sort of girl boss. This is the goddess of death, and she has no mercy to give. But I also chose to showcase this scene because it's a pretty good example of how a group of opponents should be fighting against a single combatant. Now, I'm sure we all hate it when it's a group versus a single fighter, and the fight just devolves into a series of 1v1s simply because the writers don't know how to do group fights. Which brings me to step 2, overwhelm with numbers or give a reason not to. See, most female characters are almost always already at a disadvantage in terms of physicality. Sending multiple combatants when possible and overwhelming her with numbers would be the smart thing to do, but frequently, and we see this in men's fight scenes too, other combatants will be standing around rather than swarming. See, a smaller fighter is already at a physical disadvantage against one guy. What is a girl supposed to do when you throw 5 bodies at her when she can barely handle one? Kill Bill is kind of guilty of this. The bride is completely surrounded in this scene, so what is stopping some underhanded goon from going for a backstab, especially when she's occupied in an extended 1v1? I mean, I guess they're Japanese and care about honor and stuff, right? But guys, she is literally going to murder all of you, honor be damned. Now, let's see how being overwhelmed with Yakuza members would realistically look like by checking out the scene from Netflix's Kate, released in 2021. The titular Kate threatens to kill a Yakuza boss, preventing the gang members from attacking her, but when she pulls the trigger, the gun jams, and immediately the gang members flutter. So she has to do whatever she can to equalize the odds. She then throws the boss at one of the guys with their knives out, impaling him, and that Yakuza member is now tending to his boss, temporarily putting him out of the fight. She then dispatches the other guys with a series of well-placed hits, all while evading their own attack. This shows that Kate is such a good fighter that she's able to survive an onslaught of multiple opponents. They're trying to overwhelm her with numbers, but Kate is just too good, and we see that as she successfully goes on the defensive. It's also worth noting that Kate gets thrown around like a rag doll, satisfying the first step from the video and showing that she can bleed too. In fact, Kate gets winded, and this scene is emphasized in the film. But like I said earlier, if your 1v5 fight is going to devolve into a series of 1v1s, there needs to be a reason for it other than the guys just standing around waiting for their turn. A great example of this is Vi versus Silco's gang in Arcane Season 1. In this scene, Vi, a teenage girl with exceptional fighting ability, has to hold a narrow bridge versus a gang of thugs. But the choke point is so narrow that the gang has no choice but to send themselves in at 1 or 2 at a time, and that dramatically evens the odds because Vi is characterized as an exceptional hand-to-hand fighter even at such a young age. She's able to dispatch this series of fighters who are all older and bigger than her because she's able to accomplish the third and most important step in making a female fight scene realistic, which is step 3. Establish a win condition and play for it. If you didn't already know, a win condition is a strategy or set of circumstances that when achieved leads to victory barring unforeseen or unusual events. It's kind of like an imaginary checkbox, saying that if this happens, you win. Now, not every fight needs a win condition. In fact, some fights are so stupidly one-sided that the win condition is to just exist, but frequently female characters, specifically ones with more traditionally feminine builds, will usually need an established win condition when faced with a bigger, stronger opponent, simply because they can't outfight them. This doesn't apply to some of the fights that we've seen earlier, like with Hela, because like I said, the power levels are too one-sided to really need one, but all the other fights I've used as good examples have a win condition that the female character needs to meet. To beat Namora, Shuri needed to set a trap, blasting him with fire when he least expected it. Kate, against the Yakuza, needed to always have a weapon with her. When she gets disarmed, she has no choice but to engage in hand-to-hand combat, and this leads to her getting thrown into a table. She's a capable weapons fighter, but her win condition is to stay armed because when she isn't, she's a ragdoll. Which brings us back to Vi. What's her win condition that she's able to dispatch these foes that are all bigger and stronger than her? The answer actually lies in a simple equation. Metal plus skull plus impact equals concussion. If she can land a good shot to the head, that's one less enemy combatant that she has to worry about. It's important for her to dispatch opponents in the most efficient way possible because she's about to face a gauntlet, pun not intended, of opponents. If she takes too long to deal with someone, she'll expend too much energy and lose to attrition. So she has to go for headshots to take her opponents out swiftly, and doing so ensures that their strength advantage doesn't actually matter and she gets to conserve her energy. And this is exactly what she does, and she plays for her win condition. The first guy she beats is with an uppercut, then takes out a woman with a mean left hook, then dispatches this headband thug with a groin hit, followed by a right hook to the bald guys. But we also see what happens when Vi doesn't play to her win condition. The headband thug that Vi didn't punch in the head comes back to grapple her, but creatively, Vi figures out that there's another win condition. If they're off the bridge, they're no longer a threat, and throws the headband guy off. And Vi beats every single person in the scene with either a clean headshot or by yeeting them off the bridge. But another pet peeve of mine is when a fight sets up a win condition for the female combatant, but the writers choose to ignore it for girl power. And surprisingly, this very pet peeve of mine is evident in my favorite action movie of all time, John Wick Chapter 4. In this scene, the female character Akira, portrayed by Rina Sawayama, has a bow. Despite its primitiveness, a bow does offer a lot of advantages over a typical firearm. It's lighter than a rifle, has no muzzle flash, and is relatively silent. In the open, at night, with low visibility, the bow user may have a stealth advantage. And we even see that despite the goons having body armor, arrows are just as effective as you would think, even in the hands of the nameless goons who are fighting side by side with the titular John Wick. Also note that Akira is being portrayed by a literal pop star, thus has the body of a pop star. Compared to the armed men she's facing, she is a lollipop, and it would be in her best interest to stay away from hand-to-hand combat, especially considering the biggest disadvantage that the bow has compared to a firearm. Firing an arrow takes time because you have to knock an arrow, draw the bow, and loose, but pulling a trigger on a rifle or a handgun lets you fire a projectile instantly. So given that they're fighting in Akira's home turf on a low-light rooftop, at night, while she has a bow, and it is at a clear physical disadvantage, wouldn't the best course of action be to use stealth and take out the goons from the shadows? Well, the writers decided that it's better for her to engage in hand-to-hand combat with the goons and use the bow more like a wooden club. The dumbest thing is that she chooses to do this. It's not like she's out of ammo. She has arrows right on her holster. She makes the conscious choice, while armed with nothing but a bow, to leap at a group of goons who all have guns and could end her life if they just reacted to her, which they definitely could have done because she had to run up first and then leap. This is a bad fight scene because she's untouchable. She doesn't get overwhelmed when the enemies can easily do so, and she doesn't have a win condition that she's playing towards to overcome her physical disadvantage. Imagine this scene had the roles reversed, and that instead of her being an important character in the John Wick universe, she were just a goon leaping at John Wick himself. She'd just get eviscerated and we'd think nothing of it. Instead, Akira has such blatant plot armor that she's able to engage in CQC with a bow against armed men who are all taller and heavier than her and still come out on top. But you can't call this scene out without also calling out John Wick himself surviving a fall off a building before the events of this film, and even here he lives getting hit by a car and having what feels like the entire assassin world on his ass, and then there's also a literal blind guy who's a better shot than most action movie leads. And I say this because if we're going to claim that a woman action character is unrealistic because they're able to throw men around despite being 50 pounds lighter than them, we should at least hold that same standard to other characters within that piece of media. Anyway, I would have liked this scene a lot more if they gave Akira a reason to engage in close combat rather than having choose to do so. Arcane does this very well when Vi confronts Jinx in Season 2. This is a great and interesting fight scene because both characters have win conditions that are opposite to each other's. As we've established earlier, Vi is a powerful close-range fighter. If she can close the gap on her sister Jinx and land a good hit, she is done for. Meanwhile, Jinx is a medium to long range fighter. She has an arsenal of guns, and as long as she can hold space against Vi, she'll be able to hit her and Vi can't do anything about it. But Jinx also has an enhanced physiology thanks to being injected with Shimmer, so she's faster and stronger despite what her stature would imply. The fight starts off with Vi picking up a metal dish from the ground which she uses as cover against Jinx's barrage of bullets. She then takes a risk and propels it forward with a punch, launching it as a projectile, forcing Jinx to relieve pressure. Vi then uses the opportunity opportunity to close the gap, achieving her win condition while simultaneously eliminating Jinx's. Then she breaks Pow Pow, Jinx's minigun, but then something happens to the Hextech weapons like Vi's gauntlets, and Jinx uses Fishbones, her rocket launcher, to fire at Vi while her weapons are compromised. Vi dodges, and Jinx tries to follow up with another rocket, but it turns out Fishbones is also a Hextech weapon and malfunctions, blowing itself up. Thus, Jinx has no choice left but to engage Vi in close combat, which is a losing battle. But what else can Jinx do? With her altered physiology, Jinx does manage to trade a few blows, but ultimately she's overwhelmed by her sister. And this fight checks all the boxes for a perfectly believable fight between a female character in Jinx and a physically superior opponent in Vi. Jinx has a win condition, but fails when that win condition is eliminated and she's forced to play on her opponent's terms. Jinx is overwhelmed by numbers when Vi's partner in Caitlyn manages to win her fight with Jinx's combat partner in Sevica, which was happening simultaneously, and makes it into a 2v1. But Jinx has nobody to blame on this loss but herself, and could have easily avoided this outcome. First of all, she could have chosen to dodge instead of blocking Vi's surprise attack with Pow Pow, and then maybe she'd still have her minigun available. And she could have ended Vi with a shot from Fishbones or even with her pistol when her gauntlets were malfunctioning, but she took too long to pull the trigger. She loses this fight because she makes so many sloppy mistakes against a physically stronger opponent. Yeah, her rocket launcher malfunctioned because of bad luck, but so did Vi's gauntlets when she could have just ended her then and there. When a fight scene is subjected to realism and girl boss armor goes out the window, the inferior fighter should lose, which is why Jinx loses against Vi and does so in such a plausible fashion, which really should tell you so much about the other characters I've talked about in this video. And it's why I look at these powerful female characters and say that they've earned their status and believe it 100%. And I hope you learned something from this video and that you leave a like and comment with your thoughts down below. Subscribe if you haven't already for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.